So let's get going. Spinal cord. This first slide on the development of spinal cord, I just want you to see one interesting fact. First of all, they color code the regions of the spinal cord here. Okay. And then what we're going to see is that the regions of the spinal cord have the same regions as the bony vertebral column that they're protected in. Spinal cord is arranged into the same regions as the vertebral column. That's cervical, cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccyx regions. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions. Give you a second to copy that. And always remember, you can hit the pause button. If you don't, get something, just run it back, of course. The other thing I want students to see on this is that in development at 12 weeks gestation, when you just have that primary curvature, the spinal cord is as long as the vertebral column. But that in growth and development, the vertebral column actually outgrows the spinal cord. We get some of our secondary curvatures here in the cervical and lumbar regions, but the spinal cord ends right around there, right around the level of L1 and L2. And then down below, spinal nerves hang below, down as you go into the sacrum and coccygeal regions. So, in the adult spinal cord, it's about 18 inches in length. It's not very thick, about this thick. I showed it to you in lab, maybe a centimeter. And it ends at around the level of L1, L2 vertebra. One last thing to note on this picture is I want you to think of this 18-inch cord as a segmented cord. And at each segment of cord, you issue a pair of spinal nerves. And you can see the spinal nerves exiting the vertebral column at every level. A segmented cord, a pair of spinal nerves issued at each segment. NN is my shorthand for nerves. moving on. In this slide, you see what the brain and spinal cord look like when you remove it from the skull and the vertebral column. And you've had to cut all of those cranial nerves and spinal nerves to kind of remove the whole central nervous system from its bony encasement. The cranial part, which we'll get to next, is basically the brain and the brain stem. And remember, it has all the great sensory organs like eyes, ears, tongue, smell, all the great senses that we'll learn about later. Today we're going to focus on the spinal cord. Again, it's segmented. Think of it as a reflex organ. Spinal cord information goes in and out, okay, like a knee-jerk tendon tap, a reflex. But information can also ascend and descend to and from the brain or the cerebrum. So, if information ascends up the spinal cord to the brain, that is sensory function. If information descends from the brain to the spinal cord and out to a body part, that's a motor command, and that's worth writing down. Sensory info travels up the spinal cord to the cerebrum, which is the brain. So again, cerebrum is brain. Just remember, sensory traveling up. Information to the brain is sensory. Information traveling down is a motor command. And that's motor information. Motor info travels down spinal cord and out to effectors like muscles or glands. I usually use red for motor, and blue for sensory. In this picture, you see the spinal cord inside the vertebral column, and what you've had to do is, of course, remove the top of the vertebral column. You've also had to cut what's called the dural sac. The dura are the meningeal layers that protect the entire central nervous system, so that's also cut open. So it's hard to see the anatomy of the spinal cord. So what I did was I kind of zoomed in the top half here. There are some things I want you to note. There's some landmarks here. So there's C1. C1 is actually behind your upper jaw. And then you can see the medulla, that's part of the brain stem. It continues on with the spinal cord here. And this little bit where the spinal cord thickens a little more, you should write that down. That's called the cervical enlargement of the spinal cord. Spinal cord features. cervical enlargement. The spinal cord is a little bit larger here because of the cell bodies in this region. They actually control your upper limb, your arms. So cell bodies are a little larger. They control upper limb. Here's a picture of the real anatomy of the spinal cord. Same view, you can see the spinal nerves coming off there at each level. You can see it's a little bit thicker here. Okay, so that, again, it doesn't label it, but again, that's our cervical enlargement for the top region of the spinal cord. So now we're kind of looking at the more inferior part of the spinal cord. And one thing I want you to note is this structure here, the conus medullaris, the cone tip end of the spinal cord, right below the lumbosacral enlargement. This thickened area controls the lower limb. Let's write that down first. Lumbosacral enlargement controls lower limb. So pretend this is the end of the spinal cord. It kind of ends as a little cone tip. Call that conus medullaris. What's hard to see is that there's a meningeal layer covering the nervous tissue of the spinal cord, and it's called the Pia Mater. Of course, there's the Dura Mater and the arachnoid mater. The Pia Mater, what it does, I'll use blue for the Pia Mater covering. It covers the spinal cord Pia Mater, but it continues on. It extends down past the conus medullaris. That little terminal thread, which we call the Phylum Terminale. It's not on this figure, but it's on the next one. Phylum Terminale. The Phylum Terminale is an extension of the Pia Mater. The term means final thread, and it helps anchor the spinal column down there in the sacrum. An extension of Pia Mater means the terminal thread. Okay, well, that's not the whole story there, because surrounding the Phylum Terminale are all of these spinal nerves which continue on inferior to the end of the spinal cord, which is conus medullaris, again, at around the level of L2. And all those spinal nerves coming down Someone thought that looked like a horse's tail, all these spinal nerves with the Phylum Terminale right in the middle. And they call it the cauda equina, which means horsetail. So that cauda equina. So now, Phylum Terminale, cauda equina, and conus medullaris. Here's a cadaver specimen. You can see cauda equina right in the middle is the terminal thread, Phylum Terminale, and there's conus medullaris right there. So I wanted to give you the whole figure where these images came from, just so you can study. Although I didn't teach everything here, but most things I did teach. We'll get to everything. And here's some questions for you, and this is kind of like just a pause, and you should try to answer these as we go along. It's my check for your understanding, these questions. And if there is a quiz associated with a lecture, I usually try to make these questions the basis for the quiz, and also, expect to see them covered on a proctoral lecture exam. So I'll pause for a minute and drink some coffee. You guys can try to answer those. These questions for you, again, are just kind of like a study guide. Make sure you're getting what you need to get out of these lectures. And I'll always go over the right answers so you have confidence that you're getting what you need to get. But do try to answer them on your own. Try to challenge yourself here. Well, anyways, at what level does the adult spinal cord end? Around L1, L2 vertebra. What's the cervical enlargement? Well, it's the top region. The cord's a little bit thicker there because of those enlarged cell bodies that control the upper limb, right? So that answers that. What region of the body does it control? Upper limb. What's the lumbosacral enlargement? That's the enlargement towards the bottom of the spinal cord. And that enlargement, those cell bodies control lower limb. The cauda equina, it's primarily spinal nerves hanging below the spinal cord. And right in the middle of it was the Phylum Terminale. So the answer to number 4, spinal nerves. The Phylum Terminale, I said, is an extension of Pia Mater. So that answers that. We'll move on here. All right, so here's one spinal cord segment. You can see there's a pair of spinal nerves being issued here. I cut that one off. Let's focus on this side, and let's kind of draw out the different nerve roots and spinal nerves that I want you to know. That's usually how I draw a segment of a spinal cord. This deep groove here is the anterior median fissure. Anterior means the belly side, so ventral. Sometimes they call it the ventral median fissure. So anterior or ventral. I use both terms interchangeably, but there's a little groove right there, and that's the posterior or dorsal median sulcus. Posterior or dorsal, that means back. Median sulcus. That little hole in the middle runs up and down through the whole spinal cord. It's the central canal. Now let's talk about this gray tissue. We'll talk about it later, but this butterfly shape, that's gray matter and then white matter. Okay, the gray matter is usually gray because of cell bodies have a grayish color, and the whitish color is due to the myelination of axons. So gray matter cell bodies. White matter, mostly axons, the myelination of it. So I'm writing myelinated axons. So copy that down, I'll erase those terms and we'll draw some of those nerve roots. So let's start with this top root here. This is called the dorsal root, okay? Or sometimes it's called the posterior root. I tend to use dorsal. There's a nerve root coming off down here. That's the ventral root. Notice dorsal root and ventral root merge to form spinal nerve. Ventral root. Again, you can call it dorsal or posterior root, the ventral root or anterior root. Either you need to know. They merge to form spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is a very short nerve. In this picture, it's right there. It immediately divides into this small branch called the dorsal ramus or posterior ramus, and this bigger one is called the ventral ramus or anterior ramus. Ramus means arm. These are the two arms or branches of a spinal nerve. Spinal nerve dividing into dorsal ramus, and ventral ramus. What you should know is that sensory neurons, they kind of live in the dorsal root. The cell body of the sensory neuron is right here. It has a unipolar structure. We learned about that, look in your notes. Unipolar structure right here. One extension coming off, hence unipolar. It divides into two branches. A long branch is out in the peripheral nervous system. The other process goes into this dorsal horn of the gray matter. Or it would synapse onto an interneuron. So that green cell, interneuron, the interneuron is a kind of a go-between cell. It's completely within the CNS, and it will synapse onto the correct motor neuron for the correct response. Say this is a reflex. Remember, the spinal cord is a reflex organ. So red for motor. Right here. So what we see here is that the ventral root is strictly motor in function. But that the dorsal root is strictly sensory in function. Information goes in this way. Information to the CNS, that's sensory. Then you synapse to an interneuron, and information going away from the CNS this way, that's motor. And then we see that the spinal nerve is mixed, it's sensory and motor. Here it is completely labeled for you. Some of these structures I didn't teach, those are autonomics, we'll talk about it later. But here's the ventral root, dorsal root, spinal nerve, we did talk about that. Posterior, anterior ramus, same thing as dorsal, ventral ramus. Okay, and the other thing we learned is where the cell bodies are. So let me write that down before I erase all of this. I want you to know that the cell bodies for the motor neuron are right here. We call this the ventral horn. They're inside the CNS. Cell bodies in ventral horn. The cell bodies of the sensory neurons, this is called the dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of cells. So there'll be a bunch of cell bodies in there. I just drew one. Cell bodies in dorsal root ganglion. And we're going to move on. Here's some questions for you to answer. I'll give you a second. All right, let's go over the answers here. Which nerve root is only sensory? Which nerve root is only motor? Dorsal root is sensory. Ventral root is motor. Where are the sensory neuron cell bodies located? Dorsal root ganglion. Which nerve roots are sensory motor mix? But I guess since I asked number 2, I should squeeze in another question. Where are the cell bodies of the motor neurons? Right there. The ventral horn. Do you know both? Moving on to number 3. Which nerve roots are sensory motor mixed? The nerve root that's strictly sensory, dorsal root. Again, which one is only motor? Ventral root. It's kind of a repeat of number 1, but then mixed. That's spinal nerve, okay? Then, spinal nerve divides into dorsal ramus and ventral ramus. Both of these are also mixed, motor and sensory. So let me continue on with my picture here. Imagine the sensory fibers going to both rami. Sensory and motor. It's kind of hard to draw, so just know that spinal nerve, dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, they're all mixed nerves. They have sensory and motor function. Okay. So mixed, mixed, and mixed. Let's move on. Right in this figure here. Here's sensory neurons coming in. They synapse in the dorsal horn. There's some inner neurons here. And the motor neurons, they come out here. So sensory function, motor function, the spinal nerve here is mixed. So this is just looking at the gray matter there. So let me draw this out again. This right here, dorsal horn, that's for sensory fibers synapse. You have somatic sensory and visceral sensory. Somatic sensory is information from dermatones, or basically information from your skin, the sense of touch, vibrations, pain and temperature of your skin. That's somatic sensory. Remember, viscera means contents. That's information from your organs. Like you can feel your heart beating in your chest, or you can feel your food digesting. Okay, so that's visceral sensory. Both are information coming to the CNS, right? Then you have motor function, VM, SM. That's the lateral horn for visceral motor function. So visceral motor function, motor commands to your organs, like to make your heart beat faster or slower, or motor commands to make your intestines squeeze food to push it towards the rectum anus in digestion. Things like that. Organs, contents. But then to control muscles, that's somatic motor. This red horn here, this is the ventral horn. Right there. So that is where the cell bodies and the motor neurons are that control muscle, skeletal muscle. I'll put red for motor. Affect your skeletal muscle. Again, visceral motor, organs of your that's basically smooth muscle. That's what I'm trying to say. Visceral motor, smooth muscle. So that's motor commands. But then sensory information, again, visceral sensory, again, that's organs and that's skin. Okay? So I want to move on. We got the horns. Dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn. And this figure is fully labeled on the next slide. And let's talk about some associated structures with the spinal cord. Right here, these are what are called the Meningeal Layers that surround the spinal cord in the middle. I believe this is a cervical vertebra. And let's define all of these things, 1 to 6, which are outlined for you here. Number 1, epidural space. That is the space outside of the Dura Mater. Hence, epidural means overlying. You can see it's not an empty space. It's pretty much filled with fat and blood vessels. So I'll say outside Dura Mater. Filled with fat and blood vessels. Number 2, the Dura Mater itself. The term means tough mother. It is the thickest of the meninges. Meninges means membrane. It's the thickest, toughest one. It means tough mother. Number 3, arachnoid mater. That word root means spider because this layer there's some cobwebby, spidery looking things. Can't really see it here, but these little things right there, they appear like cobwebs. So that's why it's called that. This word root means spider, as in this cobwebby spider webs for this layer. Number 4, subarachnoid space. Deep to the arachnoid, of course, the space right in there. In this space, deep to the arachnoid mater, cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, it circulates within this space. That's what I want you to know about it. CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, circulates here. Number 5, Pia Mater. It's right on covering the neural tissue. Means intimate mother. Pia Mater, intimate mother. It's right on the nervous tissue. Directly covers neural tissue. Number 6, denticulate ligaments, not one of the meningeal layers, but I thought I'd mention it. They provide lateral support, they're on either side, they provide lateral support to the spinal cord within the space here, which we call the vertebral canal. Again, I'm going to provide lateral support to spinal cord. Here's another picture of the meningeal layers covering the spinal cord, and I kind of like it because they strip it down layer by layer all the way to get down to the spinal cord itself. But going from outer to inner, the tough Dura Mater, and it's all windowed open here. You can see here this cobwebby, spidery looking appearance, spider's web looking appearance of the arachnoid mater, and then Pia Mater right on it. So we're looking at 3 segments of the spinal cord because we have 3 pairs of spinal nerves being issued at each segment. And let's move on. This is an overhead view. You can see the spinal cord right there, and there's our nerve roots. Okay, so again, this is posterior, so that would be dorsal root, ventral root. The problem here is this big disc, which the discs join vertebral bodies, okay, forming a joint. But we can see here a problem, a lifetime of maybe bad posture, like bending forward. When you bend forward, you push this back, and eventually the annulus fibrosus, which surrounds it, may rupture, allowing the nucleus pulposus to herniate. That is a herniated disc. So this is one clinical thing that could go wrong, obviously. If you pinch nerves, that's not going to feel good. That's going to be very painful. It may cause spasms. And usually this could occur in the lower back where the compression is the heaviest because it's like on the bottom there. So herniated disc. Basically a rupture of annulus fibrosis. You should know the annulus fibrosis, because we covered this, is actually many layers of fibrocartilage. That's the tissue type of the annulus fibrosis. They call it that because it looks like rings of a tree. When you cut like a tree, look at the tree stump. Anyways, the tissue is fibrocartilage. So rupture of annulus fibrosis allows the nucleus pulposus to herniate. May occur at the level of L4, L5, or L5S1, commonly. So this last slide kind of ties it all together. You see spinal cord right here. You can see communication up to the brain. If anything is going to reach your awareness, it has to reach the cerebral cortex, this outer gray area here. And if you're going to command and say move muscles, as in writing when you're taking down notes, it has to start from here, go all the way down to say the muscles of your fingers so you can write. So let's kind of talk about these nerve pathways. You have one going up and one coming down. The one going up is the sensory pathway, and one going down is the motor pathway. The idea of a pathway, again, is you have a series of cells in order. And they're all in communication with one another. Don't start with number one, the sensory receptor. You can feel the pen in your hand, the sensory receptor. You have the sensory receptors in the dermatomes of your skin. That's what you said before. So first cell in this pathway, we should call it the sensory pathway. So let me do that. Pathway up to the brain. First cell, sensory receptor, which is associated with this sensory neuron. So but let's stick with the numbers here. Number one, the sensory receptor, the touch receptor, so you can feel the pen in your hand. Okay, so sensory receptor this example, it's a touch receptor. What we see, that sensory receptor is actually a part of this extension here, which is a part of the sensory neuron, number 2. So again, the sensory neuron, the cell bodies, and the dorsal root ganglion. And physiologists consider this cell, they call it the first order neuron, the first cell in this chain of cells going up to the brain. First order neuron. So consider number 2 the first cell in this chain of cells. As you can see, it's going to go all the way up here. It's going to synapse right there. So number 3, the first order neuron synapses to this interneuron, which is the second order neuron. So number 3, what's happening is, I'll just say sensory neuron synapsing with the interneuron. The interneuron is acting as our second order cell. Second order neuron. So we got first order, second order neuron, so that synapse right there. The second order neuron is going to go to the thalamus inside your brain. So that's step 4. Second order neuron travels to the thalamus and it synapses with the third order neuron. Travels up to thalamus, that's inside the brain. Synapses onto third order neuron. So that's it. We finally got to the third cell. Third order neuron. Then step 5, third order neuron, it travels to the correct part of the cerebrum, the part of the brain that is for feeling this part of your hand or your fingers. Okay? Each part of the cerebral cortex, there's some body part that corresponds to a part of cortex in your brain. So we're on step 5. I'm just going to say that the third order neuron travels to the correct part of the cerebral cortex, the outer gray matter of your brain. You know, this is when you quote unquote feel it. It's reached to your awareness now when it gets there. Feel it, not felt it, sorry. So let's do the motor pathway. You feel the pen in your hand to write the correct letters. You must issue motor commands from your cerebral cortex all the way down to the muscles that control your hand. And so let's count the cells. There's only two. The first cell, starting from here, that's the upper motor neuron. It's number 6. Call it motor pathway. So I'll use red for motor again. Number 6. Now you're issuing a motor command, so you first stimulate the upper motor neuron. You're going to control your muscle. That upper motor neuron comes all the way down to the correct spinal cord level. And number 7, it's going to synapse to the lower motor neuron. So upper motor neuron synapses onto the lower motor neuron. And then for number 8, the lower motor neuron is innervating the correct hand muscles. Now in a sort of term we should know, neuromuscular junction. That's the junction between the nerve and the muscle. Next slide. Consider these questions. Number 1, where sensory neurons synapse where? I was thinking of this picture. Oops, not that picture. Run it back a few slides, right here. Sensory neurons synapse in the dorsal horn. So answer, dorsal horn. Number 1, dorsal horn. Where are the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons, of visceral motor neurons for number 2. Right here. The cell bodies of visceral motor neurons are in the lateral horn. The cell bodies of the somatic motor neurons are in the ventral horn. So again, visceral motor neurons, lateral horn, somatic motor neurons, ventral horn. Okay. A herniated disc is a rupture of the fibrocartilage, which we call the annulus fibrosus. A sensory pathway takes how many cells to reach the cerebral cortex? 3. first order, second order, third order neurons. A motor pathway takes how many cells to reach the muscle? There's 2. Upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron. Okay? So that ends this first lecture. Look for a quiz for this one and many more lectures to watch. Thanks for watching.